Tim Snyder, could you first begin by telling me how you think we have misunderstood Putin's motives?
Well, I think for too long we've considered him a tactician whose ultimate goals were not so different than everyone else's. This war has revealed what I think should have been clear a while ago, which is that he's an ideologist. He has an idea about what Russia should be like, and that idea includes controlling Ukraine. I think that's the thing that we've gotten wrong. We've been trying to make him more rational in our terms than he really is. He has an idea, but the idea is not one with which we're familiar.
Do you think this is much more about empire and those sorts of ideas?
Absolutely. No, empire is a very good word here, because it's empire in the sense of controlling territory. It's empire in the sense of looking at another country and saying it doesn't exist, which Mr. Putin is doing with Ukraine. He's saying there's no nation, there's no state. It's empire in the sense that when you find another nation and a state which you don't recognize, you have to subordinate them, dominate them, quite possibly destroy them. But it's also empire in the sense of having a grand idea. Mr. Putin wants to leave behind him a grand idea of Russia, not just the Russia as it actually exists, but a Russia which has some sort of mission. So in that sense, it's empire too.
So once we get our heads around that, how does that help us work out what kind of negotiation is possible?
I think that's a wonderful question, because I think what we're looking at is a situation where, having been wrong about Ukraine, Putin has to continue. So he was wrong that Ukraine doesn't exist. That the whole special military operation idea is based on the assumption that Ukraine doesn't really exist. The nameless peoples who live there will be happy when Russian soldiers come. The Ukrainian government will flee or fold. None of that happened, but it's clearly what Mr. Putin expected. So now he has to hurt Ukrainians until they admit that he was right. And that's what we're seeing now. All this senseless murder by shells and bombs of women and children, refugee columns. It's all about humiliating people, wounding them so that they can accept his version of reality, which isn't going to happen. So I think what we have to accept is that in order for there to be negotiation, the Ukrainians have to win first. The Ukrainians have to be in a position where Putin recognizes that his own fantasy about the country is not just hurting millions of other people, it's hurting his own chances for staying in power, which is all he cares about.
And so, I mean, do you feel we're sort of at that point at the moment? Because Ukrainian politicians are talking quite defiantly about the possibility of military victory, of humiliating Russian forces.
Well, I don't know about humiliating, but the Russian campaign is not going as expected. And just the sheer mathematics of it don't look very good for Russia. And I mean, you have to listen to the Ukrainians. The Russians themselves, when they talk about asking China for help or bringing in Syrian mercenaries, I mean, these are not the kinds of things that you do if you were winning. They're the kinds of things you do if you were losing. And Russian losses on the field seem to be really quite terrifyingly large. So I think it is important in the West that we recognize that what we need is not some kind of a muddle. What we need is for the Ukrainians to win. And because if the Ukrainians win, then we can get some kind of reasonable negotiation. So long as Putin doesn't understand that he's facing a future where the Ukrainians have won, he's not going to go to the negotiating table. So it's very important for us to realize that the way this ends is the only way this ends is that the Ukrainians win. If they don't win, then it doesn't end.
And if they don't win in those terms, I mean, what are we looking at? Just a long war of attrition in which Russia keeps inflicting pain?
Well, we're looking at a Russian attempt to destroy a nation. So we've already seen what that looks like. People who are behind Russian lines are deported. People who are journalists or local mayors disappear. We'll be looking at the Russians attempting not just to control territory, but to change the society that lives on that territory, so that people can be humiliated, dominated until they accept that they're no longer Ukrainians, which is, by the way, why the Ukrainians are fighting and why it's obvious to them that they have to fight. So we'd be looking not just at a long war where more and more Russian soldiers and more Ukrainian civilians die. We'd also be looking at the spread of this kind of political oppression on the territory of Ukraine itself.
If you're right about how we have misunderstood Russian motives and what Russia wants, we'd better examine why.
Well, I mean, in a sense, there's an opportunity here. I mean, it's an opportunity for us to recognize in the West that there really is a pluralism in the world of values. You know, not everyone is trying to be like us. There's an opportunity to recognize that other people read books that have different ideas in them, you know, and that the world isn't necessarily going the way that one wants it to go, and therefore one has to take active steps to try to make it go the way you want to do. You know, that freedom and democracy are in a competition where history is not on their side and capitalism is not on their side. But there's also a specific opportunity with respect to Putin. I mean, since Putin's worldview is that he's fighting against the West, not just against Ukraine, if you support Ukraine, you're not doing anything that he doesn't expect. He already thinks that's the way that the world works. You know, he believes he's in a war to try not just to destroy Ukraine, but to make our societies look weak and incapable of defending themselves. He already thinks that. So we're not really running any big risks if we show that that's actually true, that we actually do care about democracy and that we understand that Ukraine can't lose.
And so when the West sort of watches those long television speeches by Putin and sort of dismisses them as the ramblings of, you know, the inaccurate ramblings of a man who's losing the plot. I mean, that's sort of dangerous ignorance in truth, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly right to, one has to criticize his history because he is wrong about history on the facts. But you're absolutely right that that's less important than grasping that there's an underlying vision here. And there is. The underlying vision is that Mr. Putin is a hero who's come from some special place outside of history, whose task it is to repair a broken world by bringing Ukraine and Russia back together again. That's how he thinks. It may seem strange, but it does have an internal logic to it, and it does dictate action. It dictates an action to invade Ukraine and to try to destroy the nation. So we're wrong if we laugh at it. We're wrong if we dismiss it. We have to take it seriously, but take it seriously as a different way of seeing the world, right? And then once we take it seriously, because dismissing it is a temptation to do nothing. Because if you think, oh, it doesn't make sense, therefore it will fail, that's not true. Things that don't make sense succeed all the time, and they succeed by forcing other people not to make sense, right? Which is what Russia is trying to do with Ukraine right now. Ukraine's a pluralist country where people have all kinds of opinions. Mr. Putin has a very simple opinion, which is that Ukraine doesn't exist. And it's that idea, which may not be correct, but it's that idea which is motivating this horrifying war. And once we recognize what it is, we not only know, that we have to stop it, we have an idea of how we can stop it.
Well, if Ukraine needs to win, are Western leaders then basically doing the right thing by giving Ukraine whatever weapons they can?
Yes. I mean, look, if Ukraine is it's not just me, like if Ukraine is as important as Western leaders themselves say it is, then it would seem to follow that a substantial percentage of the defense budgets of Western countries would be devoted to aid to Ukraine. And while aid to Ukraine has been significant, and it's involved some breaking of taboos on the part of a country like Germany, it's still tiny compared to how much money we actually spend on defense. So it's worth raising the question, what if Ukraine, let's put it this way, everybody says Ukraine is important. Foreign Minister Lavrov of Russia says that the future of the world hangs on Ukraine. The Ukrainians say the future of the world hangs on Ukraine, and Western leaders also say the future of the world hangs on Ukraine. So if everybody agrees that that's true, then the question would not be, why we're giving so much. The question would be why we're giving so little compared to the outlays that we have on security in general.
And what do you make of the idea that Putin would ultimately want to go further, that he would want to go to Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, to threaten NATO more bluntly?
I think one has to understand that this is all part of one campaign. I mean, in Mr. Putin's world, the West is hypocritical, and the West represents a kind of order that shouldn't exist, with all of our pluralism and unpredictability and messiness, and the fact that when a party in Britain loses an election, the prime minister steps down, that sort of thing he really doesn't like. He doesn't want, the world should be governed by dictators who rule forever, and everything should be clear and clean. and there shouldn't be any rivals to his way of doing things. So the West, by way of its existence, is a sort of threat. And Ukraine is a problem because it doesn't fall into his scheme. Instead, it's a messy democracy with an elected leader, President Zelensky, who came out of nowhere. So Mr. Putin's ideas are about Ukraine, but they're also about the West. And by the way, in the last couple of days, what they've been talking about more than anything else is Poland. And Russian politicians have started to talk about the denazification of Poland, that like Poland is Poland's next in line. So I think the logic here I think is pretty clear. The Russians are not doing well in Ukraine. It's important for them not to do well in Ukraine. If they win in Ukraine, it's not just that they would be stronger, in some long term as they take over Ukrainian resources. It's also that then becomes a mode of how you deal with countries. You just make up stuff about how they have to be invaded, then you invade them. That's what Russia's actually doing. And if we let it work in Ukraine, not that it's up to us. I mean, the Ukrainians are the ones who are doing the actual work here. But if Ukraine does lose, then of course, that's going to be a form of politics, which is now acceptable. You make up ideological claims about your neighbor, you invade them, and you expect that to create unity inside your own country. But I mean, that's a dark vision, but it's actually not working so far. And the critical thing is to say, okay, it's not working. One has to make sure that it really doesn't work, that it fails in an obvious way.
And what do you think it tells us about the possible use of nuclear weapons? Are we making a big mistake to think we can't imagine any of our leaders using them, so surely he wouldn't use them?
I think in general, people worry about nuclear weapons a bit more than that. I think people are aware that Mr. Putin is perhaps not like our leaders, at least in every respect. I guess my thinking would be something like mutual assured destruction still applies. It always has. It never stopped applying. I think Mr. Putin, very much wants to be alive. That's clear from his COVID isolation and the way that, the very ginger way that he approaches all public meetings, which are incredibly rare. It's clear that he's a man who wants to stay alive. So I don't think that has really changed. I think more likely, and the Ukrainians themselves are afraid of this. I mean, more likely is some kind of limited use of chemical weapons, or in Ukraine itself, and then blaming it on the Ukrainians or the Americans or something like that. I think that's a more likely scenario, like one where it wouldn't be obvious how one would. It wouldn't be obvious how one would react to it, and it wouldn't seem to pose such a direct immediate threat to Russia. So I think that's the kind of limited use of weapons of mass destruction is the thing that we should be sadly, horribly prepared for, and thinking about how we then respond beyond just being shocked by it.
Finally, how do you think we should respond in terms of the strengthening of our own democracies?
That's a wonderful question, because it really does begin. It begins with us. I mean, the Ukrainian democracy has a chance because of the Ukrainians, but and I think a positive way this ends is that we recognize that democracy is something that you take risks for. Not everybody has to take the kind of risks that the Ukrainians are taking, but a little bit of a risk sometimes is very important. I mean, an immediate lesson for our democracies is how important it is not to fall into crazy myths about innocence in the past, as Mr. Putin has done. It's a tendency in all of our countries, in Britain with empire, in the U.S. with respect to race, to imagine that that we were great at one point, we were pure at one point. That kind of thinking is incompatible with democracy, which has to be about a future, which embraces more and more people, and which does better and better. And then finally, that we're all in this together. If we have to help the Ukrainians. In some ways, the Ukrainians are really helping us, because they bought us all of this time to think about what's important, for ourselves. They bought us all this time to think about how we would defend all of our democracies. And so what they're doing is a lesson that, we're all in this together. We have to learn from one another. Democracy is not doing very well around the world, but there are lessons, there are examples that we can follow.
Tim Snyder, thank you very much indeed.